Before America tried to forget Hazel Scott, she was one of the most brilliant and magnetic performers the country had ever seen. She dazzled audiences with impossible speed, elegance, and confidence, turning the piano into something that looked almost supernatural. For a brief moment, it seemed history had no choice but to remember her name forever. But talent alone has never guaranteed protection in a country built on selective memory. Hazel Scott would become proof that brilliance can be celebrated publicly and erased just as quickly. Long before television fame, before Hollywood glamour, she was simply a child whose gift arrived too early to ignore. Hazel Scott was born in Trinidad in 1920 before her family eventually brought her into the growing cultural world of Harlem. Harlem in those years was alive with ambition, elegance, argument, rhythm, and artistic fire that changed the shape of American culture. It was there that Hazel's remarkable ear and restless fingers began to astonish everyone around her. She could hear complex music once and reproduce it with a confidence that startled trained musicians. Her mother, herself deeply involved in music, quickly realized this was no ordinary childhood talent. Hazel was not being taught to become good. She was revealing a level of genius already waiting inside her. At an age when most children still struggled with discipline, she was already entering serious musical spaces adults respected. Her gift opened doors, but those doors did not lead into a world prepared to treat her fairly. Even in brilliance, she would always be asked to prove more, shrink more, and accept less. By her teenage years, Hazel Scott had become a sensation in the clubs and performance rooms of New York. She did not merely play the piano. She commanded attention with poise, beauty, and a style audiences could not forget. Her performances carried both technical mastery and a kind of effortless glamour that made people stop and stare. She could glide between classical precision and jazz improvisation in ways that made her feel entirely singular. Audiences did not just admire Hazel Scott. They felt they were witnessing someone who belonged above ordinary categories. 21. In an America obsessed with sorting people into narrow boxes, Hazel refused to fit cleanly inside any of them. She was sophisticated, bold, black, elegant, and intellectually self-possessed in ways that unsettled many gatekeepers. Her rise brought attention from major venues, powerful circles, and eventually the machinery of Hollywood itself. And that was where admiration began to collide more openly with control. Hollywood saw Hazel Scott's talent and understood immediately that she could captivate audiences on a national scale. But the industry also carried rules about race, image, and obedience that narrowed what stardom could mean for her. She was welcome as long as she entertained, dazzled, and remained safely within boundaries others designed for her. Hazel had no interest in being reduced into a smiling symbol built for someone else's comfort. She objected to degrading wardrobe choices, humiliating portrayals, and the expectation that Black performers accept insult as opportunity. That refusal made her more than talented. It made her dangerous to an industry built on controlled appearances. She wanted to be seen with dignity, not filtered through the distortions that so often shaped Black life on screen. That insistence on self-respect would define both her greatest strength and her growing vulnerability. Even so, Hazel Scott's fame continued to rise beyond nightclubs and film appearances into something even more extraordinary. In 1950, she became the first Black woman in America to host her own nationally televised program. It was a breakthrough so significant that it should have secured her place in every major historical memory. Here was a Black woman at the piano, in control of her image, entering American homes on her own terms. For one luminous stretch of time, Hazel Scott seemed to represent a future larger than the era around her. She was not merely included, she was centered, admired, and impossible to overlook. But visibility in America has often come with a hidden condition: remain impressive, but never become inconvenient. Hazel Scott had already shown too much independence to remain safely decorative for long. The country around her was growing colder, more suspicious, and increasingly willing to destroy lives through accusation and fear. This was the age of anti-communist panic, blacklists, hearings, and careers ruined by rumor alone. Public figures could be dragged into national suspicion whether or not evidence had anything to do with truth. Hazel Scott found herself pulled into that climate, where image could be shattered faster than it had been built. She chose not to hide quietly, and instead defended herself with the dignity she had always insisted upon. But in that era, dignity did not always protect you. Sometimes it simply made the punishment more public. The same nation that had applauded her brilliance now watched her through a darker and more suspicious lens. What should have been a defining triumph became the beginning of a long and devastating unraveling. Her television show disappeared, and with it went one of the most powerful public platforms she had ever possessed. Work became harder to secure, invitations thinned, and the machinery of fame began quietly turning away from her. Nothing about Hazel Scott's talent had diminished, yet the space allowed for her had suddenly become much smaller. This is how erasure often works, not with one dramatic ending, but through a steady removal of oxygen. A face once seen nationwide can vanish slowly enough that the public barely notices it happening. And once memory begins to dim, institutions rarely rush to preserve the people they previously treated as temporary. Hazel Scott had once represented possibility, but possibility is often celebrated only until it becomes politically inconvenient. She had not failed publicly, she had simply become too difficult to package safely. That distinction matters, because forgetting often disguises itself as natural decline when it was never natural at all. Her story did not disappear because it lacked importance. It disappeared because too many powerful people preferred silence. Race, gender, media control, and political fear all tightened around the memory of Hazel Scott. She had reached a place very few women like her were ever allowed to reach, and that made her fragile. The tragedy was not only that she was pushed aside, but that later generations were taught so little about her. A pioneer should not require excavation, yet Hazel Scott must now be rediscovered almost like buried evidence. And still, what survives of her carries astonishing force, intelligence, style, discipline, courage, and refusal. She remains one of those rare figures whose dignity seems visible even in silence. To remember Hazel Scott properly is to confront how often American culture consumes greatness without preserving the people behind it. She was not simply overlooked by accident. She was made easier to lose. Her story asks a hard question of every generation that inherits the spotlight she once helped build. Who gets remembered as a legend, and who gets left behind once their usefulness begins to fade? Hazel Scott deserved permanence, yet history gave her distance, fragments, and a fading echo where recognition should have stood. But memory can be restored when the buried are spoken aloud again with the dignity they were denied. Hazel Scott was not forgotten because she lacked greatness. She was forgotten because greatness became uncomfortable to keep visible. And that is why Hazel Scott remains one of America's most haunting vanished icons.